welcome to EcoVapor's The Road to Net Zero Goes Through Your Tanks webinar, where we're going to focus on tank battery emissions. We have a fantastic panel with us. Jason Rowe, Chief Executive Officer with EcoVapor, is going to be leading. Our special guest is Dr. Peter Roos, President, CEO, and co-founder. Raise your hand, Peter. All right, welcome. Hans Mueller, Chief Operating Officer with EcoVapor, is also with us, as is EcoVapor's Strategic Marketing Manager, Jeff Wilson. With that said, Jason, I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you, James. Appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for being here live with us today. We appreciate it. We're excited to be here with you, and we know your time is valuable. So we hope that you find today's content insightful and valuable for you. So, I'll kick off with a brief intro here before we pass into some of our panelists. Our industry continues to be under pressure. We're aware of this, but with that said, we also know how critical affordable, reliable energy is, and we continue to make progress as an industry on our emissions footprint. But as you know, we all still have a lot of work to do. We've read a lot about the different initiatives that exist today. You've seen the Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative. You've seen some of the changes in regulations along the way. The new upstart of a lot of the ESG disclosure and the ESG performance by companies really starting to make a difference. A range of different regulations varying per state, as you've seen different gas capture rules, non-attainment zones being declared. But one thing that I think is, and we're going to talk a little bit about today, is a little bit of this notion of data transparency and the increase in, one thing that's been a positive with this movement is that we've really spent a lot of time increasing our learning and monitoring of our emission sources. And with that, learning a lot more about the differences that we can see and some of the impacts that we can make based on different operations that we have going on in the field. You see some of these initiatives like the Environmental Partnership, OGMP 2.0, many operators continuing to join there. You saw a handful of new operators just joining that recently. So, but look, we understand that this is a challenge that needs to be met head on, and fortunately, I think our industry is up for it. So, before we jump into some of the more meaningful content today, we appreciate you being with us. Just wanted to give a quick intro on who EcoVapor is in case some of you are new to us and what we do. As people are familiar with the production process, really contributes a large source of our industry's emissions footprint. And that's really where EcoVapor focuses our time and energy. We're here, we provide solutions to help to mitigate natural gas flaring and venting. We're founded on this notion of how do we eliminate waste from our operations? How do we eliminate the waste that can be turned into valuable production? And that's really where we spend our time. So on the oil and gas side, we provide solutions that really enable this full recovery and sale of your vapor stream from a production site. We have solutions like oxygen removal, H2S removal, coming out with new solutions, also helping with tank pressure control, mobile solutions to help with those operations that aren't of the continuous nature. And we also have the ability to provide site assessments, helping you understand where that emissions footprint may be coming from. So really, all of these solutions focus on how we can eliminate these wasteful emissions and turn them into profitable production. We also recently entered the renewable natural gas space with gas upgrading solutions. So, and we're very excited about that. So anyway, that's a quick kind of high level on us before we jump into the real content for today. As was mentioned earlier by James, we're privileged today to be joined by Pete from Bridger Photonics. So Pete, why don't I hand over to you for a quick introduction on your end?
Yeah, thanks. For those of you who don't know me, Pete Roos, the president and CEO of Bridger Photonics. We've over the last 6 years developed gas mapping LiDAR with funding from the Department of Energy, their advanced research arm, ARPA-E. And through that, we came up with gas mapping LiDAR. And look, our goal here is to make the emissions reduction simple for the operators. Make it dead simple. So what we've done is we've come up with a sensor, and you can see a picture of it there. We stick it on the underside of an aircraft, in this case a strut. We fly over oil and gas infrastructure throughout the entire natural gas value chain, from the production sites down gathering lines, boosting stations, transmission lines, compressor stations, all the way down to the city gates, and we're flying for utility companies to uncover their emissions as well. We hand our clients a map that pinpoints and images and quantifies every important emission in the infrastructure. And so I would say, though, that the detection side, showing folks where the emissions are, I think the technologies, us and others out there, they exist now to solve this side of the problem. That they exist today. The harder part is maybe more of what this talk is about, is mitigating those emissions, fixing the leaks. That's harder. It's a harder part. So I'm kind of here today to discuss a few case studies, but I'm also doing a good bit of learning today in this webinar. So thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Pete. My name's Jeff, and of course the question today is that we want to get into is the role or the significance of tanks in contributing to emissions from the upstream oil and gas industry. And one source, EPA developed several years ago, using emission factors, a estimate of the industry emissions by source, by equipment source or source on site. And this chart on the left shows that. Based on the EPA data, this is 2019, which is the latest data published by the EPA. And in their evaluation, pneumatic devices were the largest source of emissions in the industry at 37%, followed by flaring, and then followed by tanks. So tanks is the third largest source of emissions according to these figures. Now, emission factors, if you're not familiar, are an emission rate that is then multiplied by the frequency of an activity on a well site. So clearly these are estimates, they're not measured. These are not direct observations, these are estimates. And the source that EPA used for developing these is shown at the lower right side of the chart. And of course, EPA is trying to find a way to quantify the magnitude of the issue, but also by having these types of emission factors, they're also able to evaluate changes that they might make in regulation that would impact favorably the emissions from the industry. So anyway, on this chart, based in 2019, tanks were the third largest. There's another study that was done, the data's a little older, 2017 data, but it's from the Department of Energy, another study using the same greenhouse gas inventory database, and did look just at upstream flaring. And in terms of upstream flaring, about half of it was from, in terms of CO2e, was from associated gas flaring. And the tanks were the second largest source of flaring, which was about half the volume of associated flaring is from tank batteries. And then there's fracking and some other sources. But the point here is if we look at EPA's data based on emission factors, tanks fall into the top three sources of emissions from the upstream industry. And then there is direct measurement, which if we move forward, we want to compare what has actually been observed with the latest technology, such as Bridger Photonics. I'm going to pass this to Pete. There's several case studies, and Bridger was involved in several of them, and Pete can explain this certainly better than I can. Pete?
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so we're going to talk about 4 case studies. We were involved in the first 3, and then the last one I'll let Jason discuss, and that's Carbon Mapper did that last case study. So this first one was conducted in Canada in 2019 by Matt Johnson's group at University of Carleton. And so what they did was they flew us over oil and gas infrastructure production sites in British Columbia. They didn't even tell us they were assessing us. We thought it was just a job for British Columbia, which was valuable. It turns out that was valuable. They tested us in terms of our detection sensitivity, everything else, without us even knowing, which was actually turned out to be a great thing. And what the results show were consistent with what we're going to see in several of the case studies here. But from what we found, the top three were tanks, flares, and compressors. And almost universally, we find that through every basin that we measure. And not necessarily in that order. Sometimes tanks come up in number two or three, but always in the top three are tanks. And the public information that we show here, each one of them has tanks as the top emitter. And so, okay, and what they did for this study, they flew us. We identified the pieces of equipment where the emissions were coming from, so we could attribute that emission to that piece of equipment. And then they went back and compared it to OGI results from a previous foot patrols. And so what they found was, number one, we ended up finding a large amount more of emissions than the ground crews found. And they think, we don't know exactly why, and significantly more, like between 5 and 18 times more emissions than the ground crews. And some things are pretty clear. Number one, the ground crews weren't looking for flares. And so you can see there's no flares on the right plot. There's no flares there. So right off the top, the ground crews weren't looking for flares. Other things, what we've heard anecdotally from operators are, yeah, sometimes they have trouble seeing the emissions from tanks because some folks don't allow their crews to go up on top of the tanks to image it with the OGI cameras. So they do it from down low. And they tell us that lots of times when that can be a cause that they miss those emissions from tanks. And then compressor stations also, or compressors also, they say, look, this is another blind spot that we found in our OGI LDAR scans, is that, hey, those emissions are coming out of the exhaust on compressors. So those are a blind spot for some of the OGI scans as well. But in general, that was the fractions are similar for the OGI results with the omission of flares that is what we caught in terms of the aerial survey, but the total amount was significantly less. And so what we found is, in general, the OGI scans are finding actually more emitters, a larger number of leaks, but the total emissions is smaller. So they're finding the smaller ones, and we cut those smaller ones off, and we can go more sensitive to catch them, but we find that in general, look, when we fly a basin, we're catching more than 90% of the emissions. So look, don't make them do the rest. Don't make them fix the small ones. We're catching what's important, the most important emissions that matter appreciably to the total emissions. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, so this was a CAMS survey. CAMS is a great organization. They were pretty early on. This started in 2019. We ended up doing the study early 2020. Same general results. And this is the largest. I'll point out that last study was pretty small sample size. This one started to get larger, over 5,000 pieces of equipment. Again, in this case, we got tanks and compressors. This time, flares were swapped with separators. But same general result. Tanks are up there, and this is definitely, we find the emissions from tanks is a consistent theme here. All right, go to the next one, and that was in the Permian, I should say. And then this was a great one, TRP Energy. They wanted to show transparency here, and they published their results on what folks found. Again, small sample size for this one. This was conducted in 2020. 25 facilities that we surveyed, and this one, due to the small sample size, it looks like tanks were even larger, 68%. I guess that's tanks and tank flares combined, and then flares separately have their own category there. But okay, small sample size, but again, we see the same trend. Tanks are a large component of the emissions, and I think that's the theme for today. That yes. Through all of our case studies, tanks are a significant emission contributor for the equipment type. All right, now I'll turn it over to Jason, and he'll handle the last case study, which we were not involved in.
Yep. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate that. Good insights there. A lot of good information. And yeah, in my previous life, we participated in that TRP study as well. And so a lot of good information came out of that study. So this last one that we'll highlight was recently published by the EDF. And there were a variety of different participants here and different survey collections here. This was done over the course of, different methods between 2019, 2021, in which this, and the information was released in 2022. And you can see here the University of Arizona, JPL, Carbon Mapper were one of the sources. You had Scientific Aviation also doing some aerial surveys. Then they also used some vehicle-based surveys, OTM, and then there was also some helicopter surveys with utilizing OGI, Leak Surveys Inc. that were also participating in helping to gather this data. And you can see where the data is available. A lot of good information out there on PermianMap.org, and you can see some of the results here and what the methodologies were. And then the chart you see on the right really stems from the OGI data and the helicopter data that was performed during these surveys. But once again, as you can see here, tank vent, the thief hatch. I mean, the tank's essentially making up close to 3/4 or a little bit more than 3/4 of the emissions that were found that were found in this survey that was recently published. So once again, a lot of good consistency in this data that kind of points to what some of the usual suspects are here, and which I think that a lot of people probably intuitively can see and are used to seeing when they do their LDAR surveys, but at the same time, a pretty stark departure from what we've also seen reported in the past. So then as we move on to, if we look at kind of the aggregate here and we start looking at, okay, well, what are we finding? What is the summary? What is the comparison of findings, at least based on this handful of surveys that we've seen here? And so, I mean, I think, there's a few things that I would say here. And so one is, of course, look, as an industry, we're still learning, right? I mean, we move more and more from modeling and calculating to measuring our emissions. And as we continue to learn and as we continue to measure, of course, that means that we can learn to focus our solutions where some of these greatest pain points are as well. And so, and of course, these large discrepancies can, of course, mean that we and operators may be spending our time fixing problems that aren't as large of a problem as we may see. And so, you look here, you look at the data and you start with the top. I mean, tanks, no matter which survey you're looking at here, which application you're looking at here, order of magnitude 3 to 6 times the contribution versus the contribution of the overall emissions footprint versus what we're currently modeling based on the emissions factors that are being used today. And then you can see here, I mean, flares, we know flares, compressors, very, very meaningful part of the equation as well. And you can see that highlighted here, specifically with flares, both on measured and modeled compressors. As we move on, measured, certainly a meaningful impact, and then, on the and then whereas the emissions factors, not so much. And then another very, very large departure here from what we're modeling versus measuring is, of course, the pneumatics, the fugitives and the pneumatics. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just order of magnitude difference there in production equipment as well. A lot of different equipment is lumped into there. So really, what kind of key conclusions you see here is, tanks continue to be a much larger contributor to these production process emissions. And as we said, sometimes upwards of 6 times the contribution of what we're seeing versus some of these calculated emissions. So, and then, as we move on to the, just a kind of a handful, a sampling here of some comments that we also picked up from some of these different studies that I think are worthwhile highlighting here. And so, one, we've hit on the consistency of, tanks being such a significant volume of the emissions, but I think there's a few other comments in here that are worth highlighting. So one being here that, it didn't necessarily correlate with production volumes. So whether it's high rate facilities or not, the results were, were pretty consistent in the fact that they were still a meaningful source of emissions. And then I think another thing that, we should take from these studies as a learning that I think are important is, low oil rate facilities they cannot be dismissed as negligible. So, so the correlation here, it can vary, but still, the fact that tanks continue to, highlight as, kind of one of the either 1, 2, or 3 in any of these studies. And then the fact that, even these low rate facilities, can put off significant emissions is important to take from these studies. And, I think that, when we look at why some of these emissions factors may be off, I think one thing that, we can probably all relate to is operations happen, right? I mean, you can't necessarily model what's going to happen in a given day. You can't model a malfunction. You can't model a process upset, or any of these other items that, even though they may be short-lived, can also make material impacts to all of these data sources and to all of these just your day-to-day operations in terms of how you're managing your emissions footprint. So some very, very interesting tidbits that also came out from these studies themselves. Moving on here to, so look, we can briefly just touch on here. So what are the regulatory implications? And, so first off, I would say these are complicated issues, and they can vary greatly by state, by region, wherever you may be. And the other thing that I think is important to state here is that we are by no stretch of the imagination experts on this topic. And so, but with that said, there's a few things that, we could highlight here that I think are worth highlighting. And so, one is that, pretty consistently, and if you look at, some of the EPA proposed regulations, tank flaring is generally still permitted as an acceptable emissions control device. That's pretty consistent no matter where you're looking here. And of course, there are non-attainment zones that are being contemplated, including in West Texas, Southeast New Mexico, and already in place in places like Colorado. But still, generally speaking, the tank flaring is an acceptable emissions control device. And so you look at some of the specifics per state. So you look at places like New Mexico, and you are starting to see that you do have to provide notification, you do have to provide justification of flaring over 50 MCF per day at this point, and that's kind of on the leading edge of where states are headed right now. And then Colorado, as we mentioned, you do have the non-attainment zones, the ozone non-attainment zones that are mean that you have to limit your major sources to 25 tons per year. This also can mean that we have to make sure that we keep track of these emissions even coming from places like the tanks or the tank flares. And then, but even no matter what the regulations say, I think one thing that's been impactful, of course, is the ESG movement that we've all seen. And you see really significant progress being made by operators, including many operators have committed to and have already put into place elimination of routine flaring. And so, the only thing that I think is worth highlighting there, kind of the big but here, is that most of these flaring metrics that we're seeing today don't necessarily consider the tank flare as part of their routine flaring or their flaring metrics in general. And so just, one of those items that as we continue to learn, as we continue to see where these sources are and what some of the solutions might be, some discrepancies there. And so, making progress, still very, very complicated issues, as we all know, and look forward to continuing to making progress in these areas. So just, to kind of conclude here in terms of what is the data showing. So, I mean, as we see clearly, whether you're looking at measured emissions, whether you're looking at modeled emissions, it's pretty clear that tanks play a significant role, which is exactly why we've kind of titled this, this presentation, well, Road to Net Zero goes through your tanks, because, our hypothesis here, our thesis is that, of course, you cannot get there without addressing this problem. And so, the more and more time and energy we can focus on these problems, the better off we all can be. Of course, other conclusions. flares, compressors, very meaningful sources, and of course areas of focus. And we've seen a lot of focus coming in through time here. And tanks can be a relatively special case here, as is noted, because there isn't necessarily a correlation to your production volumes, and they can sometimes be a challenging problem to solve. But the other thing that I think an implication that we is also worth highlighting here while we're talking about conclusions is that not only are these representing a significant environmental opportunity, these also represent a significant financial opportunity. A lot of times this tank vapor is the richest gas on your production site. And so the ability to capture, the ability to purify this gas, the ability to make sure that this gas is monetizable, if that's a word, or sellable, it is hugely important. And not only can we make a significant difference in our operations and our emissions footprint, but we can also generate significant cash flow and continue to enhance the profitability of our production. So a significant, so once again, we find this to be a really meaningful opportunity. So with that, actually, I'd like to, we've talked a lot about how tanks are a significant cause or significant source of emissions. I'd like to pass over to my colleague Hans here, who can talk a little bit about why, what are some of the causes that are leading to the tanks being such a significant issue. So Hans, over to you, man.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. I'm the COO and co-founder of EcoVapor. My name is Hans. Thanks again for your time and attention here today. Let's jump straight into the causes and effects of tank emissions, both uncontrolled and controlled. So let's look at uncontrolled, also known as venting emissions, and their impacts first. Start with tanks. Common ratings for API condensate tanks on upstream production facilities are 8 ounces, and the most popular rating being 16 ounces per square inch. We do see some higher than that, but they are far less than common. However, there are usually 2 types of pressure relief devices, both pressure relief valves and thief hatches, with tiered set points that begin to vent at pressures lower than the tank's overall pressure rating in order to prevent an overpressure situation. And that's usually at or around 12 ounces per square inch. Those overpressure situations, they can be generated by a variety of conditions though, both upstream and downstream. And on the upstream side, usual suspects include intermittent or surging production. We see that with initial production on new horizontal batteries, but as Jason mentioned earlier, we also see this in older wells too, particularly ones that employ plungers for artificial lift. Also see high gravity condensate production associated with unconventional shale plays that condensate. It's close to its boiling point. Oftentimes it's right there. Also, we see over-reliance on VRTs and heat, both being common causes for overpressure situations on tank batteries. On the downstream side, we're essentially talking about takeaway capacity of the tank vapor space. And really that can be pointed to flare and combustor capacity ratings. They're always based on the gas delivery pressure at that inlet flange. That's not the same as what pressure your tank battery is operating at. And oftentimes they can be rated at 16 ounces per square inch, which really isn't possible if you have a pipe connecting your tanks to the flare tip itself. There's pressure loss associated with that. And those venting issues can be exacerbated by unexpectedly large pressure drops between that tank battery and the flare tip. And we talked about pipes, but in particular that can be undersized pipe or long distances. Also something that's caught some operators off guard is the presence of liquids in the line. Essentially a J-trap scenario that limits the cross section, that capacity of the flare line to take that gas in the first place. Also, pilot light reliability issues can see combustors shut themselves in if they detect that the pilot light is out. So all these can contribute to larger than anticipated pressure differential that either limit the capacity or increase that likelihood of venting at your tank battery in the first place. So the takeaway here is that tanks are passive devices from a pressure standpoint, and the status quo has been to not actively control their pressure. A quick example of that passive situation, that status quo, is where tanks need to actually pressure up in order to push that gas to the flare tip. But an actively controlled situation is one where the suction side of a compressor, like a VRU, is in direct communication with that vapor space of the tank battery itself. And that VRU actively maintains a suction pressure set point. Pressures are managed, and overpressure situations are effectively eliminated through proper facility design. Let's move on to emissions associated with combustion or flaring, that method of controlling tank emissions. So I'd say VRTs might be a good place to start. They definitely do help reduce the vapor volumes at the tank battery. However, a lot of times, almost always, performance is less than advertised. And it's really not the operator's fault. It's because the simulation software that they're using to design their facilities, like ISIS or Promax, they assume perfect separation. So what I'm saying is that these programs assume that the second your water gets to 212 Fahrenheit, it's all steam, but it's not. It takes time for that phase change to occur where it transitions from liquid to gas. And the same is true for pressure-driven phase change phenomena. So this has caught some off guard because their simulation software will tell them that they can assume 90+% capture efficiency, where real life measurements actually indicate it's more like 67 to 70%. So you can end up flaring or combusting more vapor than you anticipated in the first place, really through no fault of your own. And that gas that isn't captured, those higher than anticipated volumes, are typically flared or combusted. And that's due to air contamination, specifically O2, and that prevents midstream gas gathering pipelines from accepting it because oxygen, A, disrupts the amine treatment process in gas plants, and B, it corrodes their asset, it rusts their pipe, and nobody likes pipeline leaks. So gas blankets are another method to combat exactly that, and they work great when they work. But it's pretty frustrating when they don't, and that can be more often than one might anticipate. I think it's important to talk about the history of gas blankets, what problem they were intended to originally solve. And what they were intended for was to prevent an explosive mixture from occurring inside a tank. And with tank vapor, Le Chatelier's principle tells us that explosive mixtures form when air concentrations are between 90% and 98%. So 10% to 2% hydrocarbons, that's a lot of air. And gas blankets, let's give them credit, they do a great job of preventing that situation from forming. But asking them to prevent 0.001% oxygen, that's 10 parts per million, when the air immediately outside of these thin wall tanks with hatches and other openings is a bit of a stretch. That's, preventing 209,000 ppm of O2 right outside from getting to be 10 ppm, it's just tough. And I'd also argue that that's not the gas blanket's fault. It's just intended to solve a different problem. So flaring, even with the highest efficiency combustors in existence today, it has consequences. And aside from greenhouse gases like CO2, which plenty is made, but it's a non-regulated pollutant. Let's talk about VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Whether those are the product of incomplete combustion or through direct venting, when those are combined with nitrous oxides, which are a product of combustion, those create ground level ozone. And I think it's also worth mentioning, especially with these combustors shown on this slide, the fuel gas requirements of these higher efficiency combustors are significant. You could end up burning over 100,000 cubic feet a day of sellable gas, gas that is perfectly fine to enter that pipeline, just to keep that flare up and running and hot, ready to accept the next vapor that is intended to combust in the first place. So, high efficiency, true in one sense, but maybe not in all. And I think it's also important just to talk about order of magnitude. And let's just look at the impact of tank vapor recovery on a per unit basis before we back it up a little bit wider. So EcoVapor's 02 E300 product, that's the most popular product that operators have adopted. It can process 300,000 standard cubic feet per day of gas. And in tank vapor applications, that gas quality typically ranges from about 2,000 BTU per cubic foot to, we've got, I think, 5 or 6 different samples that are over 3,400 BTU per SCF. So let's just take the lower average of 2,500 BTU gas. And to get a sense for the chemical energy equivalent on that, that's over 9 megawatts of power. That's more horsepower than the most powerful locomotive ever built. Each one. There's a lot of energy that is going up in literally smoke right now that could be recovered for beneficial use. And on a CO2 equivalent basis, each of those 02 E300s has the capacity to remove about 3,500 cars off the road. So let's just take a step back for a second and look at the overall capacity of EcoVapor's deployed fleet in North America. That includes the E100 with 100 MCF capacity, the E300, the E1200. Soon we'll be releasing new models. But just from a current deployment standpoint, that footprint has grown in the past couple of years. We're nearing 200 units deployed in total today. That number continues to grow every week. But right now, today, we have the capacity to recover the energy required to heat over 900,000 homes. 907,000 homes is what we can heat today, just based on the energy that we're capturing that would normally go in the flare. And going back to the emissions equivalent, on a CO2 basis, using EPA figures for an average footprint of a passenger vehicle, EcoVapor's deployed fleet is capable of removing over 800,000 cars worth of emissions off the road. So obviously we have a goal to get to a million in each of those figures, but the way things are going, it won't be too long, and we're excited that operators are recognizing that this is an effective way to treat the tank vapor emission issue. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Jason.
Hey, thanks, Hans. Appreciate it. And look, I know. So, but before we kind of open up for Q&A today, I think it's always worth. We've identified problems, we've identified sources of problems, we've even identified some of the causes of some of these sources of the problems. But I think always worthwhile to hit on some solutions. And so, if we're talking about tank venting, tank flaring being the core problem, so let's a couple of solutions here. And so, as Hans just talked about, these tanks are responding to normal changes and pressure swings based upon the conditions of operations around them. And so, one solution that, of course, is employed in some cases and being more and more employed more and more widely is let's actively manage these tank pressures. It is helpful to eliminate these venting emissions, which of course are an order of magnitude more impactful than even flaring emissions can be. And so, and then on the flaring side, we still send a lot of gas. We still waste a lot of gas and literally burn this gas off into the environment. And so, the obvious solution here is let's deploy all the solutions we can to ensure that we are capturing this gas, right? I mean, let's eliminate the waste that we are continually sending via the flare. And so, by, utilizing different equipment, different technologies to help to capture all of this gas directly from these tank batteries, and then the ability to treat this gas for contaminants to ensure that it is pipeline ready is, of course, a good solution here to make sure that we can mitigate some of these large problems. And so, and then briefly, to wrap up here, just a quick what's happening at EcoVapor and what's been going on here lately. I mean, we continue to focus on solutions and continue to innovate solutions that are once again focused entirely upon how do we capture 100% of this vapor stream from your tanks. whether it be oxygen, whether it be H2S, whether it be a variety of solutions that we have in the field today, including, that we're continuing to step down these units to be able to handle more and more of these marginally production wells as we continue to reduce the footprint of our operation. And then, I'd also highlight one other item to kind of be on the lookout for as we move forward. So we have recently released what we call our vapor management system, or our VMS. It's a new product that is coming out. It is currently actually being piloted with two of our customers in the Rocky Mountain region. And so what we're trying to accomplish here is twofold, really. We're trying to look at both venting and flaring volumes. And what we're trying to do here is, one, to help you to actively manage these tank pressures, help you to actively capture these vapor volumes, but then also enabling the decontamination of these of any oxygen present in these gas streams to be ensured that we can sell all of this gas. I mean, these are specifically good solutions as well for anywhere you may already be deploying a VRT on site, which means you have a VRU on site. This eliminates the need to bring a second VRU to site while still capturing all of these tank volumes. So we're excited about this product. We're excited to be launching it with a couple of customers as we speak. And please be on the lookout for a webinar where we'll talk a little bit more about this product as we move forward in August. And so, so with that, I'd like to just take a second to thank everybody. We appreciate all of you being with us today. We hope that you found all of this information useful. We want to give a special shout out and thanks to Bridger Photonics and Pete. Pete, thank you for joining us today and giving some more data and some more insight to some of these problems that we've continued to see in the field. But before we let you off the hook, and before we let Hans and Jeff off the hook here too, we want to make sure that we throw it out there to some questions and see what's on people's mind in the crowd. And once again, thank you guys. We really appreciate everyone being with us today, and would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, Jason, we have a few questions. Let me start with one for Pete. We've got someone who's asked if you could comment on the LiDAR technology and its accuracy in locating and identifying emissions.
Yeah, we get that quite a bit. In terms locations is the easy answer. We typically get within 6 feet of the emissions. We drop a GPS pin within 6 feet of the emission source, and we provide the imagery so you get to see it too. So we say equipment level. Oftentimes we can get sub-equipment level on a tank. We can tell that it's come from the thief hatch, for instance, things like that. So standard is typically within 6 feet of the emission source. When we get into the cities, it gets a little harder when we're flying for utility companies because the gas can migrate underground, it can pool, things like that. We don't do as well in the cities, but that's for production and transmission. We get within 6 feet typically. The harder answer is the quantification. And in that case, it depends on your goal. So we have lots of clients that now want to be tracking their emissions inventory over time. So that's, all the emissions throughout their infrastructure, add it up and track that number over time. And for that application, we can get down to quite accurate because we get to measure a lot of different emitters. And so when we get to average over a bunch of different emitters, it boils down to, it zeroes in on the bias of our measurement. And we've shown for a number of third-party studies have been conducted now, we're as long as we get to use our preferred HRRR wind source, we're better than 10% accurate on those inventories. However, that's only if you give us a lot of emitters to average over. So basin-wide studies, no problem. There's thousands and hundreds of thousands to average over. Getting down to an operator sites, if you give us 100 sites, we got you covered. Now, as you get down to below 50 or down to 10, or if you talk about one site, now we only get one look at that leak. And there's random errors that come into play. There's different things. There's the temporal nature, sampling error. Was there an event that happened when we weren't there? And so in that case, we have to visit the site multiple times. And that is like right at the forefront of what we're studying right now. There's this balance between how many sites we get a measure over and how many times we have to measure a given site. And we're figuring that out right now, exactly what that curve looks like. But in general, we want more looks at it, a single site, or more sites. That's how we drive down the uncertainty on these things. I hope that answered folks.
You've touched on this, but there's another question about how emission volumes are actually calculated.
Yeah,
Can you address that?
So what we do is we fly over and we image the emission, and we actually have the ability to not only laterally, the picture that we always show looking down, we see laterally what that emission plume looks like. We also know the vertical profile of the emission, so we know how high off the ground it is. And so then we take that information and we pair it with our wind data source, and that varies vertically with wind. So we match the wind speed vertically from our wind source with the emissions distribution vertically, and that allows us, when you know how fast the gas is flowing and what the concentration of the gas is, that allows us to calculate what the emission rate is. Now we're working on our at the forefront of what we're doing right now is in low wind situations where there's not a lot of wind, so we don't get a clean plume. That's the hardest part for us. We get larger errors when the wind is lower, and so we're working on different ways to use the shape of our plume and things like that to get us a better indication of the speed of the gas. Okay. Did that answer that question? Hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so. If not, they'll ask again. Hey, Hans, I have a question here. One of the flaring chart slide mentioned VRT capture at 60 to 70%, and we have a registrant asking, that seems really pretty low. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I'd agree. It does seem low, but that's what measurement puts it at. It really just comes back to that discrepancy between simulation and reality, and where you can pinpoint that the root of that discrepancy is the assumption that the simulation programs make for perfect separation. Once a mixture reaches a certain pressure and temperature, these simulation programs assume that it perfectly separates into what it should, but that takes time. And I guess the other factor that is married to that is residence time in upstream production equipment. And is it long enough for that separation, for that phase change process to occur? And that's really all it comes down to. That's the only discrepancy. If you had a infinitely or maybe somewhat less than that, but a very, very large VRT, high diameter, super tall vessel, and you had a couple of hours for that oil to settle in there and for that vapor to be liberated, then you probably would get closer to what that simulation is expressing. However, since we don't, and also I guess relative to the residence time that the oil spends inside the tank battery, it's that can be days or certainly many more times longer than it spends inside that vapor recovery tower. Good example is we were called out to a facility that had recently started to produce. They had two 48-inch diameter vapor recovery towers in parallel, and they actually had the compressor pulling a vacuum on these towers. So it had negative gauge pressure, which through any simulation would tell you that the oil is completely dead by the time it exits that VRT and moves over to the tank battery. You'd have no working, standing, breathing losses to account for in that tank battery, no flash losses especially, but instead the thief axes were chattering. The battery was venting, and that's why eco vapor never took the approach to solve the problem where ultimately the problem exists. Yeah, the tank battery itself is an excellent separator when viewed from the residence time that we talked about earlier. It's also operating at the lowest possible pressure on the entire facility, and that surface area between the vapor and liquid phases is also the highest. So that's where you're going to get potentially more of that flash to occur than the simulation program would lead you to expect.
Okay. And I have another question for you, Hans. The question pertains to like oxygen contamination. I'm sure H2S is fairly understood, but the question pertains to, is this a site-specific issue, or is oxygen more of a widespread problem in gas capture?
Well, I guess the two things I'd say there is that just like any other gas, oxygen goes where it's not. It's seeking equilibrium. And the second part is that would make it more of a site-specific issue. So oxygen going where it's not is widespread. That's just a function of physics. Anywhere on Earth, that's what you can expect. But from a site-specific standpoint, I think the biggest differentiator from site A to site B is how closely that oxygen is being monitored. In some areas, it's not as high of a concern. It tends to become one once that midstream gatherer suffers some downtime, especially in their amine treatment plant. Those are particularly susceptible to O2 contamination. But in areas where there's higher scrutiny, that's usually where the most pain exists. If you have an automated slam valve on your gas sales line, and then once it detects 10 parts per million for 10 seconds or whatever that particular one is set to, and that valve shuts, what I've also seen is that midstream companies tend to become less responsive to repeat offenders. If a particular facility has been shut in X number of times over Y days, if it shuts in on Friday, they might get back to you the next week, instead of that same hour. So I think that's what the main differentiator is between from site to site is the level of scrutiny of oxygen.
Okay. And Pete, I've got one final question for Pete here. You talked briefly about threshold values, and the question is, are there threshold values used to determine what is a significant emission, or whether the observations are significant? Can you address the issue of threshold values in your studies?
We don't threshold our data per se and withhold emissions, if that's the question. We show everything we detect. But what we do is, look, when we fly for utility companies in the cities, we use operational parameters that allow us to get much more sensitive. We're down to right now with our Gen 1 sensors, it's 90% probability detection at 0.5 kilograms per hour. With our Gen 2, it looks like we're going to drop that down to what that sector needs, is 0.2 kilograms per hour. If we did that for the production sector, we would absolutely bury our clients with repairs that don't appreciably impact emissions. So what we do is we back off our sensitivity and we go at 3 kilograms per hour with a 90% probability of detection. That means for every 3 kilogram per hour leak, we're going to catch 9 out of 10 of them. For larger leaks, we'll catch a larger percent. So we're very confident above 3 kilograms per hour, we're going to catch those leaks. Below 3 kilograms per hour, we're less confident and we miss them. And look, we fine-tuned that with interactions with our clients. So we're balancing, on the one hand, look, we want our clients to look anyone in the eye and tell them we're catching more than 90% of the emissions in a basin. On the other hand, we don't want to flood them with repairs that don't appreciably impact emissions. If they catch 90% of the emissions, we all win. We're done. We got it. So let's just focus on the prize. Your eye on the prize.
Yeah, this is a question for me then. do you set those parameters with each individual operator, or is it just a standard approach?
Occasionally, we'll have an operator that says to us, you know, especially early on, hey, I want more sensitivity. We can do that. But man, you know, I think that's kind of how we zeroed in on where we did was, okay, we can do that, and they're going to get a bunch more leaks. But these days, and I don't know for sure whether we do it anymore at all. But you know, we got our standard operating procedure, and we know how high we fly, we know how fast we go, we know everything we need to do to hit our number, and pretty much we don't vary off of that. So because we're getting, like I said, we're catching more than 90% of the emissions in a typical basin.
Okay, thanks. Jason and James, that's all the questions we've got today.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thanks everybody. Thank you to our panel for sharing their expertise. We know you all are very busy, and we appreciate you guys coming on and sharing your experiences and data with us. Also, thank you very much to everyone who participated and who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you're walking away with some new ideas and some information that will help you in the battle for to reduce emissions. You're welcome to contact any of our panelists directly. Here's their contact information. That's also in the slides of the download. So we hope you have a great rest of your day. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.